You think burning your toast is bad? Try cooking squirrel stew over a dung fire while dodging rats and your cousin's foot. Welcome to medieval cooking, where survival was the only seasoning. Let's start with the basics. You need fire to cook. Right now, imagine trying to start one in the middle of a rain-soaked medieval yard with nothing but damp twigs, cow dung, and the crushed hopes of survival. There were no stoves, no chimneys, no ventilation, just a pit in the ground if you were lucky, or a fire built directly on the dirt floor of your hut, which was often shared with goats, chickens, and your extended family, all of whom smelled equally flammable. The fire wasn't just a cooking tool, it was a gamble. It filled the entire room with smoke thick enough to blind you, choke you, and maybe even exorcise your ancestors. Eyes constantly watered. Children coughed themselves to sleep. And if the fire wasn't burning hot enough, congratulations, you've just slow roasted some parasites into your squirrel stew. Bon appetit, peasant. Fat was currency. But not the kind you eat on keto. This was the rendered animal kind scraped from carcasses and boiled down into a greasy goop that doubled as cooking oil, candle wax, and emergency hair gel. People fried meat in it, rubbed it on pans, and sometimes even rubbed it on themselves. Not for fun, for insulation. It was medieval Vaseline, except you got it by slaughtering a pig and hoping the lice inside didn't jump ship. The floor, that was your prep space. Dirt-packed, maybe covered in straw, definitely covered in everything else. You dropped food on it, picked it back up and called it extra earthy flavour. No cutting boards, no countertops. Just a slippery, uneven battlefield of mud rat droppings and the occasional dead chicken leg that nobody remembered dropping. Sanitation never heard of her. Then there was the wood problem. Wood was fuel, yes, but also money. The poorest folks couldn't afford enough for daily fires, so they burned anything they could find: old shoes, dried dung, broken furniture, or if things got really desperate, the old family Bible, because starving was one thing, but eating raw goat intestines was where they drew the line. Spoiler, they didn't draw that line for long. Meals were planned around smoke and weather. Too much wind and your fire went out. Not enough and you cooked in a coffin of fumes. Rain. Say goodbye to warm food for a week. And when you did manage to cook something, the smoke clung to it like trauma. Everything tasted like burnt boot leather and regret, which is fine because it matched the flavour of medieval life in general. And let's not forget how easy it was to burn down the whole village. You think you're clumsy? Try knocking over a clay pot of boiling lard next to your only wall made of dry straw, soaked in pig grease and propped up by hope. Fire safety. That meant yelling fire and praying your neighbour wasn't already cooking their third cousin's wedding stew in the next hut over. But hey, at least everyone got to eat together. Cooking was communal, which is a nice way of saying if one person messed up the fire, everyone starved. No pressure. Imagine 20 people watching you rub 2 sticks together while their stomachs sounded like angry ghosts. And if you finally got it lit, you better not blink, because blink once and the village dog just ran off with your turnip. So next time you complain that your gas burner takes too long to heat up, picture this you in a dirt hut crouching over a dying flame, waving a chicken feather like a demented fan trying to roast a potato that still smells like last week's socks, and realising too late that you just ran out of dung. Let's set the scene. You walk into your home, if we can call a windowless mud hut with a thatched roof a home, and your first thought isn't what's for dinner, but why is it so hard to see? That's because every surface from your ceiling to your soul is caked in smoke. You're not walking into a kitchen, you're walking into a functional chimney that's pretending to be a living space. And congratulations, you're the meat. See, in the absence of refrigerators, preservatives came in 3 forms: salt, vinegar, and smoke. Salt was expensive, vinegar was acidic, and smoke was free. And it didn't just flavour your meat, it became your air. If you had to preserve a few rabbits, a slab of venison, or half a goat you found near a noble's hunting grounds, you strung it up from your roof beam and let the smoke rise. That same smoke filtered down into your lungs, your bed sheets, your soup, and your pores. There were no vents, no chimneys, no hoods to suck the smoke away. Just a fire in the centre of your home under a ceiling that soaked up every toxic puff like a sponge. The smoke clung to everything. Babies wheezed, grandparents coughed blood, and you. You laughed because coughing was medieval music, and if you were coughing it meant you were still alive. Smoked meat tasted delicious, but so did not dying of carbon monoxide poisoning. Every time you walked into your kitchen, you had to choose between breathing and eating. Spoiler, you chose eating. Because medieval choices were all like that. Pick your poison literally and hope for a quick result. And while you're chewing that extra salty leg of mutton, try not to think about the soot coating your teeth like a second set of gums. Don't even ask what happened to your clothes. Everything you owned reeked of fire. You couldn't tell if someone was cooking or just wearing yesterday's tunic. People developed a smoked human scent so strong it could probably ward off wolves-in-laws and the occasional demon. The smell never left. Even the dead smelled like firewood. And what about fire safety? Oh, you mean the concept that hadn't been invented yet. Fires inside smokehouses were open, flickering and barely contained. Kids tripped into them. Cats lit their tails on fire. Sometimes the meat dropped into the flames and exploded like a greasy torch. At least it made dinner entertaining. If you called screaming while swatting at your hair entertaining. Remember, this all happened in the same room you slept in. Yes, slept. Next to burning logs. With meat swinging above your head like a wind chime from hell. Rats scurried around the edges. Ash floated in the air like snow, except it made your eyes burn and your snot turn black. Romantic, no necessary, absolutely. Want a little fun fact? Archaeologists found medieval ceilings stained pitch black with centuries of soot. Some roofs were so caked with residue that they became semi-waterproof, like history's worst roof insulation project. Congratulations, you've smoked yourself into accidental architecture. All in the name of ham. And if you thought all that smoke was for cooking, you're adorable. People believed the smoke kept away evil spirits, because what better spiritual security system than second-hand lung disease? The line between faith and fumigation was thin. Either way, everyone choked. In fact, in cold months, the fire was always burning. That meant your home was never truly clean, dry, or breathable. You existed in a haze of wood smoke, animal hair, sweat, and meat grease. Every surface had texture, not because of design, but because of build-up. It was like living inside a brisket, with feelings. The irony, even with all that preservation food, still went bad. Sometimes the smoke didn't reach every angle. Sometimes mould joined the party. Sometimes the meat fell, got chewed by rats, picked up, re-smoked, and eaten anyway. Waste not, want not. And if someone died from it, well, maybe they were weak or allergic to rat. So if you're proud of your air purifier, take a moment, hug it, cherish its humming. Because 700 years ago, your version of cleansing the air involved adding more smoke until the mould passed out. People weren't thriving, they were surviving, barely, and they did it in a room that tried to cook them every night. Let's drop any modern illusions you may still be clutching. There was no polished marble island in the centre of the kitchen, no rustic chopping block passed down from grandma. In medieval homes, food preparation happened on the nearest flattish surface, usually the floor. Not a clean floor, not even a I just swept with my foot floor. We're talking packed earth straw thrown down for the pigs to nap on, and so much animal waste that you'd swear every meal had a little surprise seasoning. Imagine placing a raw rabbit carcass on the same ground where someone just stepped in with cow manure boots. Now imagine skinning it with a dull knife that hasn't been cleaned since the last plague. That was your food prep. If you were lucky, there was an old cloth to work on, one that doubled as a towel blanket or occasionally a bandage. Hygiene was not a priority. Survival was. Kids crawled on that floor. Chickens pecked at it. Dogs licked it, slept on it, and sometimes became dinner on it. You didn't disinfect, you didn't wash hands, You just moved the carcass a few inches to the left if it fell into something especially gross. And if you found hair bugs or dirt that's texture, roughage, an early attempt at fibre-rich living, cutting tools weren't much better. Blades were shared between food leather and occasionally minor surgery. No one blinked when someone sliced onions with the same knife they used to remove a toenail yesterday. You wiped the blade on your pants, nodded solemnly like a chef, and got back to hacking. The food didn't care. It was already traumatized by existing. Bones were chopped with whatever blunt force instrument was available. Hatchets, cleavers, a rock with enough personality. You didn't aim delicately, you smashed cracked and hoped nothing important flew into your eye. Blood spattered across the dirt. The floor got slipperier. You kept going. This wasn't a meal, it was a medieval UFC match, and dinner was the loser. Let's talk contamination, shall we? Salmonella wasn't just a risk, it was a lifestyle. Bacteria didn't just visit. They paid rent, and still everyone ate. They chewed through sinew, ignored the smell, and hoped their stomachs were stronger than the mystery meat in front of them. Spoiler, sometimes they weren't. That's why medieval people didn't live long. But hey, at least they didn't die hungry. Cooking surfaces were often reused slabs of wood if you were rich. If not, food was prepped on bark, an old boot, or the upturned lid of a barrel. Anything that resembled a surface became part of the meal. Did you just slice bread on the same plank you salted a fish on last week? Great. Now it's a seafood sandwich, boneless possibly, possibly not. And let's not forget the rodents. Mice were everywhere. They darted through homes like they paid taxes. They nibbled on everything, especially unattended prep. People would shoo them with a stick, mutter a curse, and go right back to chopping onions next to a freshly peed-on turnip. There was no illusion of purity, just grim determination and a powerful sense of, it's probably fine. Even when food was done cooking, it often returned to the floor. People didn't have serving tables. They used slabs of stone wooden boards on the ground, or just ate directly from pots left in the ashes. Communal eating meant everyone dipped their dirty fingers in. If you had a spoon, you were elite. If you had a second one, you were the local king. Eating while standing was common because there weren't enough chairs. You stood over your meal like a vulture guarding its prize. If something fell, you had two options: pick it up immediately and eat it, or let the dog have it and pretend it never existed. Spoiler, most people picked it up. There were no 5-second rules, just does it still have food on it rules? Now you might be thinking, surely someone tried to clean the floor, right? Oh, they did, once a year, with broom-like sticks, on feast days. The rest of the time, cleaning the floor just meant letting the chickens peck at the mess. Chickens, nature's Roomba. They didn't sanitize, they redistributed the chaos. Some households had raised platforms or dais to separate cooking from sleeping. But even those were no cleaner. Grease dripped, flies swarmed, and the floor remained the undisputed king of kitchen real estate. If you could walk on it, you could cook on it. That was the motto. Probably unofficial, probably sticky. The worst part, everyone just got used to it. Smell normal. Bugs expected. Food poisoning. A rite of passage. People adapted to filth like it was a family member, annoying, unavoidable, and always showing up at dinner. You didn't question it. You just hoped you'd be alive long enough to complain about it later. So next time you see someone wipe a countertop twice before chopping celery, smile. You're witnessing luxury, a miracle, a historical anomaly. Because not that long ago, humanity looked at a dirt floor, a dead squirrel and a dull knife and said, "This'll do," and somehow it did. Let's talk cookware, specifically the kind that exploded. Medieval pots weren't just cooking vessels, they were time bombs with handles, made from clay hand-shaped by someone who probably sneezed into it mid-spin. These pots were dried near a fire, maybe glazed if you were royalty, rid not you, and then thrust directly into open flames. Temperature control. That's adorable. You either cooked your soup or cracked open a ceramic death trap. Sometimes both. Most pots were earthenware, fragile, porous, and prone to cracking if you so much as looked at them sideways. The trick was not heating them too quickly, but let's be honest, tricks require options. You had fire, 1-speed chaos, if the pot cracked too bad, if it exploded, duck. The worst part, the pot never warned you. No creak, no hiss, just boom. And suddenly everyone's stew had a crunchy new texture. The thing is, most people couldn't afford metal cookware. Iron pots were rare, heavy, and outrageously expensive. Clay was cheap, which made it perfect for the poor and terrible for safety. And because firewood was precious, people often placed cold clay pots directly into roaring fires to save time. That's not cooking, that's pottery roulette. Every meal came with a chance of dental work, and heaven forbid your pot already had a hairline crack. Because then you'd watch in real time as your dinner leaked into the coals, bubbling like a tiny hellscape while your stomach wept. No backup pot, no extra ingredients, just a ruined meal and the distant sound of a neighbour chewing smugly. You didn't cry, you inhaled the ash and called it seasoning. Sometimes the food outlived the pot, like porridge that hardened into the shape of the broken shards. Congratulations, you've invented potloaf. Just peel the ceramic off like medieval Tupperware. Or don't. People often just ate around the broken bits. Because throwing out food for being mildly contaminated by pottery was the 14th century equivalent of lighting gold on fire. And no, there weren't pot scrubbers. Cleaning a pot meant scraping off last week's meal with a stick, maybe some straw if you were fancy a rock. Leftover soot gave everything a smoky flavour. Burnt edges. Normal. Exploded bottom. Tragic but expected. People adapted. You didn't need a pot to be perfect. You needed it to last just long enough to serve one meal before crumbling into dust and shame. Let's talk about flavour. Clay absorbs, meaning if you cooked fish in it last week, then milk today. Congratulations, you've invented medieval fish yoghurt. Odours lingered, tastes blended. Clay didn't care what you wanted, it gave you what it remembered. If your pot was 5 years old, it had the culinary memory of a war criminal. Some tried to line the pots with leaves, bread crusts, or fat to prevent leaking or burning. Others just prayed, which honestly had the same success rate, and occasionally someone tried to fix a cracked pot with animal glue. This held together exactly long enough for the glue to melt and reunite with your rabbit stew. The result: a chewy aftertaste and a higher chance of death. The pot was also your serving dish. There was no plating. You carried it from the fire straight to the family where everyone dug in with fingers, knives, or spoons made of wood and desperation. If the pot still had visible scorch marks, that was proof of a good meal, or a recent fire. Either way, it was hot, vaguely edible, and still mostly intact. That's a win. And don't think for a second the pot was yours alone. In poor communities, pots were shared between families, passed around like medieval heirlooms. Each one had a story, a scar, and maybe a chip or two from Uncle Jeff's famous drunken goose stew incident. So when you borrowed a pot, you treated it with reverence, or else you faced the wrath of a hungry neighbour with no dinner and a sharp stick. Even storage was risky. Pots were left on uneven shelves, dirt floors, or hanging from ceiling beams like ominous fruit. One sneeze from a child and down came your dinnerware in a crash of clay and dreams. Ever try to mourn a broken pot in front of 6 hungry people? It's not grief, it's social suicide. There were also regional pot traditions. Some places added sand to the clay to make it stronger. Others added horsehair or bits of bone. The results were mixed, sometimes more durable. Sometimes the pots howled in the fire like they were summoning demons. Either way, everyone agreed a pot that didn't explode was a blessing. A pot that only cracked a miracle. And when the pot finally died, you didn't toss it, no, you repurposed it. Broken shards became roof patching, floor filler, or incredibly sharp toys for dangerously unsupervised children. Medieval recycling at its finest. Even the tiniest chip might become a button, an earring, or a tool to scrape mould off cheese. Nothing was wasted. Everything was slightly horrifying. So the next time your microwave beeps annoyingly at you, smile. Your food is warm, your dish is intact, and your face doesn't have ceramic embedded in it. People once stared into bubbling pots like they were wild animals, cautious, reverent, ready to run. Because in the world of medieval cooking, even your cookware was trying to kill you. Welcome to the Art of Denial Medieval Edition. In an era without refrigerators, expiration dates, or even the concept of maybe don't eat that food, preservation was less science, more faith. If something smelled off, looked green, or jiggled when it shouldn't, the solution wasn't to throw it out. No waste was a luxury. The solution was seasoning. So much seasoning that your tongue would cry before your stomach had the chance. Spices were gold, literally. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves imported through blood war and the occasional camel, and used like culinary band-aids on decaying meat. Rich people used them to flaunt their wealth. Poor people used whatever they had, garlic, onions, vinegar, or if all else failed, fire. Burn it black and pretend it's charred. Sound familiar? That's because we're still doing it just with better PR and smoked paprika. But let's get real. Most medieval meat wasn't aged. It was dying. Hung in open air, crawling with flies dripping with God knows what. You didn't inspect it. You prayed over it. And if it moved, you cooked it harder. One common method of testing meat was to stick a knife in it and sniff. If the smell made you dizzy, that meant cook it longer. If you blacked out too late, sometimes the meat was already rotting when it arrived. Markets weren't exactly health regulated. Butchers left meat in the sun. Fish travelled for days without ice. You'd buy a chunk of beef, bring it home, notice it wiggle slightly and think, it'll boil out. Spoiler, it didn't. But if you added enough herbs, you could almost forget the maggots were doing the backstroke. And then came the sauces. Oh yes, medieval people loved their sauces, thick, spicy, fermented monstrosities, designed to smother whatever sins the main course had committed. They didn't create flavours, they buried corpses. A typical sauce might include vinegar, old wine, spoiled milk, breadcrumbs, and something that died in the garden last week. The result tangy, confusing, possibly cursed. This was not farm to table. This was corpse to cauldron. Even vegetables had issues. Root crops went mushy. Greens wilted to sadness. Beans could ferment in storage and explode when cooked surprise. And since nobody washed produce, half the flavour came from soil bugs or whatever the rats left behind. Still, it was better than starving. That's not a joke. That's a theme. Fruit. Don't even get started. Apples were picked unripe, dried badly, and stored until they resembled shriveled heads. Berries were eaten quick or turned to wine so foul it could strip paint. Plums became prunes before they left the tree, and everything else was boiled into jam until it tasted like regret and sugar. If you wanted fresh fruit, you were either rich or hallucinating. Now let's pause and honour the real MVP mould. It was everywhere. On bread, cheese, fruit, and sometimes your dinner guest. People didn't throw out mouldy food. They scraped it off and kept eating, or just ignored it entirely. A little fuzz never hurt anyone, they said shortly before inventing medieval diarrhea. But hey, blue cheese had to start somewhere. And then, of course, there were the leftovers. If something was slightly spoiled today, they'd stew it and save it for tomorrow. Then again, then again. Eventually, the dish became something called perpetual stew, a bubbling pot of eternal mystery meat and old vegetables where new ingredients were added daily but nothing was ever removed. It wasn't a meal. It was a lifestyle. One bad apple didn't spoil the bunch, it enhanced the flavour. That smell in the kitchen, not dinner. That was the scent of entropy, boiled and seasoned. Still, people grew used to it. When everything stinks, nothing stinks. You could eat rotten goose with garlic or half-fermented rabbit with juniper berries and convince yourself it was exotic, or noble, or just not moving anymore. Which was really the best you could ask for. Food poisoning was a constant threat. But no one called it that. They called it bad humours or ill air or blamed it on the alignment of the stars. Anything but bacteria. That was invisible. And what you couldn't see couldn't possibly be boiling inside your intestines, turning your week into a slow crawl toward death. Right, And what about dairy milk went bad fast? Cheese went bad slower. So they turned milk into cheese as fast as possible, then tried to forget how they did it. Some cheeses smelled like foot crime. Some could knock you out if left in a sealed room. But they were valuable. People traded them, prized them, and occasionally used them in warfare. Unconfirmed but honestly believable. Eggs were tested by putting them in water. If they floated, they were bad. If they sank, they were good. If they cracked and something hissed out, you fed them to the dog, or the neighbour, or the neighbour's dog. Because waste was shameful, but food chain delegation totally ethical. The irony is spice didn't just make the food taste better, it helped kill some bacteria. Medieval cooks didn't know why, but they knew adding cumin meant fewer people died. So they used it liberally when they had it. Otherwise they just turned up the heat and hoped the smoke took care of the rest. So next time someone offers you expired yogurt, don't gag. Laugh. Because medieval folks would have fought you for that. Mold, that's seasoning. Sour, that's character. Rotten, that's Tuesday. And if it tasted too fresh, you probably got tricked. Or robbed. Boiling wasn't just a cooking method in the Middle Ages, it was a survival tactic, a lifestyle, a religion. People boiled everything, and I mean everything. If it could be dropped into water and stirred, it became food. If it couldn't, well, they probably boiled it anyway, just to see what happened. Because in a world where flavour was suspicious and parasites were common dinner guests, the logic was simple. If you boil it long enough, maybe the evil dies first. This wasn't some dainty simmer. This was full-blown, cauldron-bubbling, soul-exercising boiling. The kind that peeled bark off roots and made bones soft enough to chew. Families huddled around giant iron pots if they were lucky enough to have one, or clay vessels half dissolved by years of abuse, and inside a swirling beige mess that could include vegetables, meat grain herbs, and possibly a piece of yesterday's spoon. Hygiene optional. The most beloved dish pottage. Think of it as medieval oatmeal if oatmeal was made with kale barley, leftover mutton and regret. It was endlessly recycled. Each day a little water was added, new scraps were thrown in, and the whole mess was brought to a furious boil. The pot was never cleaned. Why would it be that crust around the edge that was flavour history? Generational umami. Bacteria and spice. Boiling was safe, or safer anyway. Raw meat killed people. Roast meat sometimes killed people. But boiled meat only mildly traumatic. So they boiled to the point where even a shoe might seem edible. Stews could go on for days, weeks, even longer if no one questioned the occasional floating mystery lump. If someone fell in, you boiled them too. Problem solved. Even bread wasn't safe. Some recipes called for soaking it in broth until it became sludge, then boiling that sludge until it thickened. You could chew it, sip it, or weaponize it depending on how long you let it sit. And don't get started on peas. Medieval cooks loved to boil peas until they turned into a green paste so sticky it could seal barn doors. Flavour, number, nutrition? Maybe. Texture? Absolutely not. Let's not forget dessert. Yes, they boiled those too. Fruits were stewed into syrupy oblivion. Honey cakes were sometimes boiled to help them set. Custards were cooked over boiling water baths that curdled half the time and separated the other. If it wasn't burned, it was boiled. And if it wasn't either, it probably wasn't from Earth. And what did boiling do to flavour? It murdered it. Slowly. Boiling turned spices into shadows, herbs into mush, and meat into fibrous sadness. But it also made everything uniform. One bite of boiled chicken, carrot, and barley porridge tasted exactly the same as the next, which meant you could eat without thinking, smelling, or asking questions. A bonus, really. Pots weren't always covered, so you got surprises. Ash from the fire, a bug dropping in, a curious rat having a sip. It added character, maybe even a little protein, and if something did fall in, most people just fished it out with a stick, stirred the pot again, and carried on. You weren't going to waste a whole meal over a tiny act of nature's sabotage. Boiling also solved moral dilemmas. Got a tough cut of meat, boil it into submission. Got an old chicken that's mostly bones and attitude. Drop it in and watch the arrogance melt. Got a root you can't identify. Boil it and hope. Most poisons were probably destroyed at high temperatures. Probably. Medieval cooking was part cuisine, part chemistry roulette. You didn't need a recipe. You needed whatever you found that day, a leek, a handful of oats, half a turnip and a bit of salted eel you stole from the neighbour. Throw it in, stir, add a prayer. That's dinner. It didn't matter what it looked like, because by the end it all looked the same, hot, wet, vaguely grey and steaming with ancestral disappointment. Even utensils were boiled. Not on purpose. People left wooden spoons in the pot too long and they became part of the stew. Splinters were common. You chewed carefully, or you didn't. Your mouth toughened up over time. By age 10, a medieval peasant could eat a bowl of soup, a twig, and a small stone without blinking. And when there wasn't enough food, water. Just boil more water. Thin the stew until it became soup. Thin the soup until it became broth. Thin the broth until it was hot water with a ghost of flavour and maybe a piece of barley floating like a sad little boat. It kept your stomach busy. That was enough. Who needs calories when you have hope? Sometimes they boiled for the entire village. Massive cauldrons hanging over town fires, bubbling with donations, half an onion here, a fish head there, some dried herbs, a scrap of bread someone stepped on. It wasn't just food, it was community. Everyone contributed, everyone got sick together, beautiful in a way. Of course there were failures. Pots cracked, fires died, water ran out, and every so often someone boiled something that shouldn't be boiled, like bread dough or fermented grain. The results exploded, not metaphorically, exploded. Scorched eyebrows, lost dinners, and the occasional burned hut. But hey, that's how you learn. Boiling also made you look busy. A pot bubbling over a fire gave the illusion of productivity, even if it was just water and weeds. Neighbours would pass by, sniff the air and think, they're doing well. It was medieval PR. Keep the pot boiling and maybe no one would notice you hadn't eaten meat in a month. So yes, they boiled everything. Because it worked. Because it was simple. Because it was safe-ish. And because in a world full of disease famine and deeply suspicious ducks, sometimes a bland bowl of something hot was the best you could hope for. It didn't have to taste good. It just had to not kill you. Let's talk bread, supposedly the staff of life. In medieval times, that staff was more of a blunt object than a baked good. Forget soft centres and golden crusts. Medieval bread was dense dry, and sometimes suspiciously grey. If modern bread is a pillow, this was a brick with an attitude problem. You didn't slice it, you hacked it, with a blade, and sometimes it fought back. The average peasant couldn't afford white bread. That was for the rich, fluffy, refined and made with imported wheat so clean it practically wore a crown. The poor got the leftovers, barley rye, oat husks, ground beans, mashed up weeds, and if the harvest was bad, tree bark. Yes, actual bark. When famine hit, people literally ground wood into powder and added it to dough, and no one thought it was weird. Because death was weirder. Flour wasn't sifted, it was gritty, mixed with whatever came off the grinding stone, which sometimes included actual stone. The result, bread that doubled as dental revenge. People chewed carefully like squirrels breaking into a walnut, and even then cracked teeth were common, not to mention the risk of accidentally ingesting mould dirt or whatever the rats left behind in the flour sack. Bread was food. Bread was risk. Bread was war. Most loaves weren't shaped for pleasure. They were round, flat and heavy. You didn't smell them and sigh. You used them as trench tools. People even served meals on bread. These were called trenchers, thick slices used as edible plates. But by the time the meal was over, the trenchers were soaked in grease beer and sadness. Rich folks gave them to beggars afterward. Because sharing is caring, especially when the plate is made of fungus-dusted sponge rock. And yet bread was sacred. People gave thanks for it. They fought wars over grain. A dry crust was better than no food at all. which is saying something because some crusts were so tough you could hammer a nail with them. Dipped in broth, they softened slightly. Left alone, they could be used to chock wagon wheels. Rye bread came with a special curse ergot. It's a mould that grew on rye in damp storage and caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Entire villages were affected, dancing, screaming, vomiting black goo, and nobody understood why. They just kept eating the bread, assuming it was a punishment from God or maybe their neighbour Margaret's weird goat. Spoiler, it was science, but centuries too early. Some bakers were honest, others cheated. They added sand to bulk up flour, or chalk, or ground up bones, and they sold it anyway because hunger trumped ethics. There were no labels, no regulations, just a loaf that might sustain you, or send you sprinting to the nearest bush with stomach cramps and a prayer. And ovens, most peasants didn't have them. Baking required community ovens, usually built in the centre of a village. You brought your dough, waited in line, shoved it in and hoped no one stole it, or replaced your loaf with theirs. It was like a medieval bake-off with higher stakes and fewer Mary berries. If your bread came out unburnt, you were blessed. If it came out missing, you started a feud. Because ovens were rare, people improvised. They baked bread on hot stones in embers or under iron lids covered with coals. The results were edible, mostly. Sometimes the bottom burned while the top stayed raw. Sometimes it fused to the stone. Sometimes it turned into a hockey puck with dreams of being edible, and still they ate it. Even when bread was bad, it kept people alive. Sort of. It filled the belly. It gave the illusion of substance. It could be carried for days without spoiling, though it might evolve into a sentient creature by day 5. Soldiers marched with bread. Pilgrims chewed it for miles. Monks rationed it like gold, and peasants, they prayed for it. In times of famine, bread became legend. People lined up for stale crusts. Mothers traded family heirlooms for half a loaf. Children sucked on bread pebbles just to forget their hunger. Bakers were both saviours, and targets loved when the bread was plenty hunted when it wasn't. Riots broke out over missing loaves. Bread theft was serious business and punishable, sometimes by death. Imagine being hanged for stealing something that tasted like drywall. Despite everything, bread had variety. Black bread, rye bread, maslin, a medieval mess of barley and wheat, flatbread, ash bread. And when grain was scarce, people baked famine loaves made with ground roots, pea flour, or whatever, could be mashed into a paste. They were grey gummy and sometimes grew legs if left overnight. But again, better than nothing. Rich people, of course, had better options. They ate white bread, light, fluffy, sifted, refined. They considered brown bread animal food, which is funny because most animals wouldn't touch what peasants called lunch. But the rich didn't stop there. They added honey, dried fruit, spices, even almonds. Their bread was dessert. The peasant's bread was punishment. And when bread went stale, it didn't go to waste. It was soaked in broth, wine, or milk. It became soup, pudding, stuffing, or filler for meat pies. Sometimes it was fed to pigs. Sometimes it was the pig's meal. And sometimes in a dark corner of a cold village it came back on a plate, seasoned and reborn. So no medieval bread wasn't the crusty romance we imagine with cheese and wine. It was hard, heavy, often untrustworthy, and somehow still the foundation of life. People lived and died by it. They broke teeth, shared slices, threw it at thieves, buried it with the dead, and thanked God for every last crumb. Next time your sourdough is a little overbaked, remember at least it isn't made of dirt bark and rat hair. Imagine walking into a medieval village and following your nose. Not to something delicious, but to something, a smell you can't quite identify. Warm, wet, maybe meaty. Maybe not. That my friend is the communal cauldron, the beating, bubbling heart of peasant life. Equal parts dinner ecosystem and ongoing scientific experiment. Because in a world where scarcity was guaranteed and hygiene was a rumour, the best solution was just keep the pot going. The communal cauldron wasn't just a cooking vessel. It was a living thing. You didn't clean it. You didn't empty it. You just added to it. New meat, toss it in. Leftover bread, throw it in. Turnips, herbs, goat hooves, suspicious mushrooms. All fair game. Every villager knew if you had food, you shared it. If you didn't have food, you still shared something, even if it was just a half-eaten onion or your trust. The stew never really ended. It evolved. A rolling, centuries-old blend of ingredients that turned into a flavour so complex no one could identify a single note. It wasn't rabbit stew or barley soup. It was just the pot. Capital T, capital P. There were stories of cauldrons that had been stewing for years. Not days, not weeks, years. That's not a recipe, that's a family member. And everyone used it. At any hour you'd see villagers leaning over it, adding something stir in it, stealing a spoonful, maybe dropping in a bone, maybe taking out a rat. It didn't matter. The pot accepted all. The pot forgave all. Whether your addition was noble or desperate, the flavour got overwhelmed by the 10,000 ingredients already in there. Culinary redemption in action. There was a kind of equality in it. Nobles had their feasts. The clergy had their cellars. But the cauldron that was for the people, everyone got a taste. Everyone got sick together. Everyone blamed the mushrooms and moved on. No one sued. No one yelped. They just wiped their mouths, scratched their stomachs and went back for seconds. Because mystery was cheaper than flavour. Of course there were incidents. Sometimes the pot curdled. Sometimes it foamed. Once in a while it started bubbling without fire. That was a bad sign. People still ate it. But they knew it was a bad sign. You'd hear whispers like the stew's breathing again, or I saw it blink, and yet into their bowls it went thick, sludgy and steaming with ancestral confusion. Meat in the pot was often whatever animal had recently died, preferably not of illness, but people weren't picky. If a goat killed over stew, if someone ran over a duck with a cart stew, if the meat smelled questionable, they just boiled it longer, or scraped off the green bits, or claimed it was aged. Which, to be fair, wasn't always a lie. Some of it was aged like a wine that hated you. Fish went in too. Bones and all, heads, scales, whatever washed up or got scooped from a questionable bucket. The flavour was briny surprise. The texture was choking hazard. And if it was winter, that fish may have been frozen for weeks in a block of ice before being chipped out and dumped into the cauldron like a sacrifice. And then came the fillers. Grains, peas, beans, cheap, starchy and designed to expand in the belly. They soaked up flavour, soaked up fat and kept people full, even when the actual nutritional value was questionable at best. The trick, keep stirring. Otherwise it turned into medieval concrete. There were actual cases of spoons standing straight up in the pot like soldiers saluting the absurdity of lunch. Bread crusts were a common addition. Not fresh bread, no, that was fantasy. I'm talking old rock-hard edges that couldn't be chewed without risking molars. Drop them in the stew, let them soften, and hope they didn't sink to the bottom and fossilise. Sometimes they floated back up hours later, unchanged, defiant. Those were the lucky ones. What about seasoning, If you had herbs, you used them. If you didn't, you lied. Ah, yes, this has time, you'd say, while stirring in a weed you yanked off a fence post. Pepper was rare, salt even rarer. Most flavour came from aged smoke, and whatever fell in, accidentally dirt, ashes, insect parts, toenails. Yes, probably toenails. And no, we're not dwelling on that. The pot wasn't always indoors. In villages it sat outside in the centre like a communal fireplace, exposed to wind, rain, children and stray dogs. It boiled under the sun. It froze at night. It welcomed bugs, birds, sometimes people. Once a goat fell in. They ate around it, nobody spoke of it again. Respect. During festivals the cauldron got fancy. A whole pig, maybe. Spices if the Lord felt generous. People lined up for hours, clutching their wooden bowls and squinting into the steam like it contained hope. And it did in its own way. Hope that the meat was fresh. Hope that you didn't get the ladle with the bone splinter. Hope that your turn didn't include the part that wriggled. And what if it ran low? You thinned it with water. Always water. Not broth, just water. The stew would become soup. The soup would become broth. The broth would become suspicious. Eventually it would become a murky liquid with a memory. But people still drank it. Because that's what hunger does. It rewrites your expectations. It whispers, "This is fine," and you nod. Because it has to be. Some believed the pot was magical, that it never ran dry, that it held the village together, that a spoonful cured illness. Others believed it was cursed, that it caused illness, that it whispered at night. Either way, the pot remained, boiling, bubbling, binding people together with heat hunger and the universal desire to not die today. So next time you complain that your soup doesn't have enough garlic, remember someone once ate from a cauldron that may have contained 30 generations of leftovers, part of a squirrel and possibly a spoon. And they were grateful. Because in the grand lottery of medieval cuisine, still warm and mostly chewable was a win. Firewood was a luxury. Let's start there. In a medieval world full of cold forests and rainy fields, you'd think trees would be free for the burning. But no, most forests were owned by nobles, and cutting wood without permission was considered theft. Not small-time theft either, like get your hand chopped off kind of theft. So peasants looked for alternatives, and the most abundant, reliable, and surprisingly flammable substitute dung. Glorious, earthy, slightly warm animal dung. Now, not all dung is created equal. Cow dung, excellent. Horse dung, acceptable. Sheep dung, sure if you're desperate. Human dung, let's not. Even medieval peasants had standards, barely. The trick was drying it. Fresh dung doesn't burn it, sizzles, smokes and smells like despair. But dry dung that was medieval charcoal. Stack it, sun it, and eventually you had something that could keep your cauldron bubbling and your soul questioning everything. Dung fires weren't clean. They weren't subtle. If someone was cooking with dung, you knew. The smell hit you from 20 feet away, wrapped around your brain, and politely asked, "Still hungry?" Imagine trying to enjoy a turnip stew while the air tastes like barnyard barbecue. You didn't just cook with dung, you bathed in it, inhaled it, wore it. Everything you owned smelled like smoky butt. It was a vibe. Cooking with dung changed your food. Oh yes, everything tasted slightly off. Not quite meat, not quite smoke, more like something warm died near your meal. You could boil a clean potato and it would still carry notes of barn floor and shame. Some peasants claimed you get used to it. But let's be honest, you never get used to dung seasoning. You surrender to it. Kitchens that used dung as fuel were blackened caves. Soot-covered walls, pots and noses. Children had permanent smoke moustaches. No chimney, no problem, just a tiny hole in the roof and a prayer to the wind. Ventilation was a dream. Eyes watered constantly. Lungs coughed up enough grime to start their own garden. But hey, at least the porridge was warm. And it wasn't just home kitchens. Market vendors used dung to keep street food hot. Imagine buying a meat pie baked over smouldering horse patties, crispy on the outside, trauma on the inside. You bit and paused and wondered, is this beef or something else? And then you smiled politely and nodded, because nobody wants to insult a baker with a shovel full of fuel in one hand and a ladle in the other. Dung was free. That made it powerful. Poor families collected it daily, sometimes from their own animals, sometimes from the road, sometimes from someone else's field if they were sneaky. Kids carried baskets of the stuff, proud like little delivery boys of doom. And if it rained too bad, wet dung meant no fire. No fire meant no food. No food meant dinner was raw roots and self-pity. Of course not everyone loved dung fires. Nobles turned up their powdered noses and wrote laws to keep dung fires out of city centres. They preferred wood coal or the labour of servants with better-smelling kindling. But even some castles used dung when winter came hard and fast. You might wear silk, but you'd still eat by poop fire when the forests froze. Class couldn't save your soup. Dung was also multifunctional. After the fire died down, the ash was used in soap-making fertiliser, or horrifyingly teeth-cleaning powders. Yes, people brushed with dung ash. Because if your food didn't ruin your taste buds, your toothpaste would finish the job. Medieval hygiene was less about cleanliness and more about chemical warfare on the senses. And then there were the accidents. Dung fires could go out suddenly, leaving meals half-cooked and diseases half-killed. Or they could flare unexpectedly, sending flaming turds flying across the room. Many a cloak caught fire that way. Some dinners ended in screaming. Others ended with someone stomping on the floor trying to put out a smouldering potato and pretending everything was fine. Peasants got creative with dung. They mixed it with straw to make bricks. They smeared it on walls for insulation. They sculpted it into patties and arranged them like firewood, each pile a little tower of culinary sadness. Dung wasn't just a fuel, it was a lifestyle. Your meals, your home, your very existence was shaped by the daily deposit schedule of your livestock. In some regions, dung was honoured. Certain types of cow dung were thought to be pure blessed, even sacred. It was used in rituals, festivals, and because nothing escapes destiny bread ovens. Yes, dung-fired bread. The crunch of crust, the warmth of dough, the subtle whisper of manure. You could taste history, and a bit of hay. So why not just eat raw food, because raw killed you faster? Parasites, bacteria, and every medieval illness had front-row seats in uncooked dishes. Fire, even poop-powered fire, was the line between a stomachache and a funeral. So people cooked. With what they had, with what they scraped off the barn floor, with pride and just a little nausea. Dung became so vital some villagers organised it, rationed it, taxed it, even stole it. Dung thieves were real. People caught sneaking into another's pasture to scoop up a fresh pile were punished. Not severely, no one wanted to touch them, but socially shamed. Imagine explaining to your neighbours that you were caught red-handed with someone else's poop pie. Try recovering from that scandal. But the thing is, dung worked. It burned. It warmed homes, cooked meals, and kept babies from freezing. It was awful, but it was effective. And for a medieval peasant, awful but effective was practically a compliment. They weren't looking for luxury. They were looking for lunch. So next time you light your gas stove, take a second. Feel the clean flame, the instant heat, the lack of barnyard fumes. Then picture a barefoot peasant kneeling beside a fire made of cow droppings, blowing gently, praying it doesn't sputter out just so he can boil a bit of soup that smells like hoof and hope, and maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the modern miracle of not cooking with poop. Let's meet the most casually terrifying person in your village, the butcher. No apron, no gloves, no fridge, just a thick blade, a dirt-stained shirt, and a stare that said, "I've gutted more pigs than I've made friends." In medieval times, the butcher wasn't working in some sanitised white-tiled shop with gentle music playing overhead. No, this was an open-air, blood-slick performance art installation. Meat didn't come wrapped in plastic. It came alive. And the butcher's job, make it not. Animals weren't killed quietly or out of sight. They were dragged into the middle of the market, tied up and dealt with right there. Children watched. Dogs circled. Flies cheered. One swing of the cleaver and you had dinner. Or trauma. Often both. The ground soaked up everything, the blood, the guts, the panic, and then everyone walked right over on their way to buy turnips. And the best part. There was no refrigeration. None. Meat hung out in the open like it was tanning. Summer heat. No problem. Just fan the flies away with a broken hat or someone's discarded sock. Meat that was still dripping was fresh. Meat that was slightly green was aged. And meat that fought back exotic. The smell of the butcher's stall hit you before the sight did. A thick, metallic, meaty perfume that clung to your clothes like shame. Gut piles shimmered in the sun. Heads stared blankly from hooks. You could tell how long a carcass had been out by the number of maggots per square inch. And yet people lined up. Because where else were you going to find something vaguely nutritious and definitely covered in bacteria? Sanitation. Don't even dream about it. The same knife cut through goat, pig, cowfish, and sometimes thumb. The block was never cleaned. The table was a chopping stump soaked in enough blood to summon a demon. Water was for drinking, sometimes not cleaning. And if the butcher did wash his tools, it was with the same bucket he washed his feet in. Multitasking. Meat quality was a gamble. Some of it was fine. Some of it was already trying to walk away. Butchers weren't just slicing steaks, they were making decisions. Can I cut around the rot? Will they notice this smells like death with a dash of feet? The answer was usually yes, because poor people didn't complain. They cooked it, seasoned it, and prayed. Also, you didn't choose your cut. There was no, I'll take the ribeye, thanks. You pointed at a vaguely meaty chunk and hoped for the best. Want chicken? That's a whole chicken, feathers, beak, and bad attitude included. Want beef? Hope you like it with tendons, bone chips, and mystery fat. Bones were part of the deal. Sometimes hair, sometimes things with eyeballs. And forget packaging. Meat was handed to you in whatever was lying around, a scrap of cloth, a leaf, maybe your own hands. You brought your own sack, ideally one that didn't already smell like onions and defeat. If you were lucky, someone wrapped it in yesterday's bread crust or tied it with string made from sheep intestines. Biodegradable, at least. Let's not forget about organ meat. Liver, heart, kidneys, lungs, the pluck. All considered valuable. All sold quickly. All smelled like medieval regret. Some even believed eating brains made you smarter. Others believed blood pudding cured weakness. Mostly it just made people vomit, but who's keeping track? If it was inside an animal, someone ate it. Sometimes raw, usually boiled, always questionable, and nothing went to waste. Bones were boiled, fat was rendered, feet were pickled, heads were stewed, skins became clothing or gelatin. You didn't throw away meat, you mined it. Every part had a use, even the tail, especially the tail. Tail soup was considered nourishing, because after everything you'd seen that day, only tail soup could make it worse. Butchers were also town gossip hubs. Everyone visited them, everyone trusted them, and everyone secretly feared them. Because the butcher knew who was eating well and who was going hungry, who could afford beef and who was begging for bone scraps. They held power not just of the blade, but of information, which made it slightly awkward when someone's dinner resembled someone else's missing goat. And yes, sometimes mistakes were made. Meat got mixed up. Orders went missing. The occasional stray animal ended up on the table. Accidents, of course, or opportunity. Because when meat was scarce, nobody asked too many questions, especially not the town guard. They like their sausages too much to investigate. Some towns tried to regulate butchers, enforce cleanliness, limit open-air slaughter, create meat days. But these rules were as loosely followed as a drunk man's directions. Fines were rare, enforcement rarer. Most people just accepted it. The butcher was a necessary evil. Better to buy meat that might kill you than starve to death staring at a turnip. And let's not forget weather. In summer the meat sweated. In winter it froze solid and had to be thawed by fire or brute force. Butchers hammered steaks into submission. Soup bones cracked like firewood. People gnawed on dried jerky so tough it could double as shoe leather. And sometimes it was shoe leather, but we're not ready to unpack that yet. Despite all this, meat was a treat. Something you got once a week, maybe. Often just on holy days or weddings. Most meals were meatless. Bread, gruel, roots, and hope. So when you did get meat, you ate it with reverence and speed. Because meat attracted people. Dogs, flies, and guilt. So the next time you complain that your steak is a little overdone, think of the medieval butcher shirt stained cleaver swinging, handing over a still steaming hunk of questionable flesh, with a grin that said, "It used to scream, but now it feeds." And know this, at least your dinner came from a fridge, not a hook beside a latrine. In the medieval world, salt was both saviour and tormentor. It preserved meat, cured fish, and occasionally got rubbed into your open wounds, literally and metaphorically. Salt was gold that made your dinner not kill you. It was the difference between this will feed us all winter and this smells like it came back to life. But let's be honest, they didn't use it because it tasted good. They used it because everything else was trying to rot faster than you could eat it. Salt wasn't easy to come by. It didn't fall from the sky or grow on trees. It had to be mined, harvested from evaporated seawater or licked off the back of sweaty livestock joking. Mostly, it was traded like treasure taxed like sin and stored like it was made of diamonds. Poor folks bought it in fistfuls. The rich bought it by the barrel, but everyone used it with the same goal delay decay. Not prevent, not eliminate, just postpone the stomach-churning horror a few more days. Preserving meat meant packing it in layers of salt until it resembled a salty corpse in a culinary crypt. No refrigeration, no problem. Just bury your pork in a pile of white death dust and hope it still resembled food when you unearthed it in January. The meat would shrivel, harden, turn an odd colour and smell like tears and firewood, but it wouldn't be green. That's what mattered. And don't romanticise it. This wasn't artisanal charcuterie. This was survival jerky that could chip a molar and traumatise a generation. People gnawed on salted beef so tough it doubled as a weapon. Salt cod was a staple, mostly bone-all effort. It had to be soaked for hours just to become chewable. And even then you had to fight it, with your teeth, with your soul. Too much salt. You were dehydrated, dizzy, and probably regretting your choices. Too little salt. Your meat bloomed into a fungal disco and killed the weakest family member first. It was a delicate balance, one that required practice prayer and a high tolerance for disappointment. Salt wasn't a spice, it was a gamble. And salt didn't just go on meat, it went on everything. Butter salted, fish salted, vegetables salted, cheese. You guessed it. Salt was poured, rubbed, sprinkled, and packed into every nook and cranny. Not for taste, but for preservation. Your dinner might taste like a salt lick, but at least it wouldn't twitch on the plate. You didn't waste salt. Ever. Spilling it was bad luck. Wasting it was borderline blasphemy, and reusing it absolutely. The salt used to cure bacon might later cure fish. The salt used to preserve meat might then be thrown onto a wound, or your neighbour, depending on how well they returned your axe. Salt was currency. Salt was culture. Salt was everywhere except when you needed it most. And yet, somehow, food still spoiled. Because people reused salt to the point of absurdity. They packed meat in salt that had already been packed with 4 other meats. By the time it got to your duck leg, the salt had absorbed more secrets than a medieval confessional. Sometimes the salt was the problem. It got damp, grew mould, got bugs, still used. Even salt itself could betray you. Bad batches existed. Impure salts caused meat to decay faster. Or they brought out other flavours, ones you didn't expect, ones you didn't want, ones that made you pause mid-bite and question every life choice you'd ever made. But by then too late, salted regret served warm. And no one warned you. No expiry dates, no labels, just your nose, or your dog's reaction, or the sudden need to run outside and let nature take its course. People learned quickly, or they died quietly. Either way, salted meat was a rite of passage. Even bread had salt sometimes, if you were rich. If not, it tasted like flour and punishment. Salt made everything better, which is a poetic way of saying everything was bad until salt was involved. And even then, it was barely better. Salt couldn't hide the smell, but it could delay the screaming. And here's the irony, the more salt you used, the more water you needed to stay alive. But clean water rare, so people drank beer, which made them thirstier, which meant they ate more salted meat, which made them even thirstier. It was a salty death spiral wrapped in a smoked sausage casing. Of course, the upper class had salt in abundance. They seasoned food for pleasure, not preservation. Their salt came from the Mediterranean, sparkled in little bowls, and was applied by dainty fingers in elaborate feasts. The peasants meanwhile licked meat that had been brined in ancestral guilt and tasted like a sailor's boot, But hey, same mineral. Some towns had salt houses where entire families would pack meat for the winter. They'd spend days elbow deep in beef and brine hands, cracked clothes, stiff eyes stinging. By the end, they smelled like jerky and looked like dried fruit. You didn't walk out of a salt house, you staggered, changed, salted to the core, and salt had other uses. It disinfected wounds badly, it cleaned teeth worse, it warded off evil spirits questionable. People threw it over shoulders into doorways and occasionally into each other's faces during arguments. If salt couldn't fix the problem, it at least gave you something to blame. So the next time your dinner tastes a little too salty, smile. You're not dying of spoiled boar stew. You're not chewing mummified fish jerky soaked in seventh-hand salt. You're not praying your salted meat doesn't start whispering in the cellar. You're just seasoning your kale. In the end, medieval life wasn't savoury. It was salty, aggressively, religiously, relentlessly. Salt preserved life. Salt destroyed taste. And salt, more than anything else, reminded people that eating was survival, not pleasure. Let's set expectations. There was no sink, no soap pump, no cute little hand towel embroidered with live leaf ladle. In medieval kitchens, washing wasn't a chore. It was a theoretical concept. You didn't clean things, you scraped them, wiped them, shook them off, and then you moved on with your life carrying every germ with you like a proud badge of honour. Knives, spoons, ladles, pans, none of them met water regularly. If a knife looked dirty, it got wiped on a sleeve, or a wall, or a dog. Usually not in that order. Bacteria didn't live in your kitchen, they ruled it. The idea of separate tools for raw and cooked meat. Adorable. The same knife that gutted a fish in the morning might spread jam in the evening. Nobody blinked. That's just called layered flavour. Cutting boards were non-existent. Remember you used the floor. And once meat had been chopped, the remains were scooped up, carried in bare hands, or maybe in a cloth that also doubled as your nose rag and dumped straight into the pot. Any blood or slime left behind. That's just tomorrow's seasoning seeping into the cracks. Rustic. Now let's talk about hands. Because hands did everything. They plucked feathers, scraped entrails, stirred soup, kneaded dough, wiped tears, swatted flies, picked noses, and then served dinner. Washing. Maybe in a nearby stream. But only if the mud wasn't too thick and the cows weren't upstream. Soap, if it existed, was made from lard and ash and smelled like scorched pig, which meant most people didn't use it. 'Cause why bother? Serving vessels weren't washed either. Bowls were wiped clean with old breadcloth, or if you had a fancy moment, a splash of leftover ale. Wooden bowls absorbed everything. Last week's onion stew still in there. Last month's salted herring lingering in the grain. Every bite you took came with a side of history, literal taste memory. And communal eating didn't help. Everyone shared the same pot, same spoon, same fingers. There was no please pass the ladle. It was grab what you can before someone else's dirty hand gets there. If you dropped food on the table or floor, you picked it up, blew on it, shook off the bugs, and resumed chewing like nothing happened. Because honestly, nothing worse was going to happen. Clean water was precious. Most of it was saved for drinking or brewing beer more realistically. Using it to wash dishes, wasteful, reckless, suspicious. Instead, people cleaned pots by boiling water inside them maybe, or just left them over the fire so the grime burned off. If it didn't catch fire, it was clean enough. Probably. Animal fat was also used for cleaning. Yes, the same lard you used to fry bacon could be smeared onto pans to lift off the gunk. It worked in the same way setting your garbage on fireworks. The result was a slick, greasy surface that repelled water, attracted flies, and smelled like every meal you'd ever failed at once. But it was better than letting the rats do the dishes. Let's not forget about the plague years. People weren't just dirty, they were violently dirty. Hygiene became associated with illness. Bathing dangerous. Washing suspicious. Clean people were sometimes accused of witchcraft. So letting your pots rot in the corner wasn't just lazy, it was socially responsible. You didn't want to be the one who tempted fate by being too clean. Children did the dishes sometimes, which meant dishes got thrown into ponds buried in straw or accidentally lost behind the house. You could yell at them, or you could accept that you were going to eat tomorrow's soup out of a bowl still crusted with last night's porridge. Parenting meant compromise, especially when it came to salmonella. Storage didn't help either. There were no cabinets, no cupboards. Utensils were hung on walls, left on benches, or buried under sacks of grain. Spiders nested in ladles. Mice nibbled on spoons. Your serving fork might double as a fire poker. If you couldn't find it, use your fingers. That's what they're for. What? Butchers didn't clean their tools either. Knives used to gut pigs were slipped back into belts. Hooks were wiped on aprons. Work surfaces were washed by rain, if at all. Everything had a permanent crust. It was called patina, or evidence, depending on the crime. Even during feasts, cleanliness was performative. Lords and ladies had scented cloths to dab their fingers, but the water was often reused between guests, so by the time it reached you it was finger soup. One bowl, many hands, less hygiene, more sharing, and still people thought this was elegant civilization, they said, and when illness came knocking, and it did often, people didn't blame their habits. They blamed the stars, demons, witches, or air that smelled funny. Not the mutton stew that sat in a dirty pot for 2 days beside a sleeping pig. Denial was the real seasoning in every medieval kitchen. It's not that they didn't care, it's that they couldn't afford to. Survival didn't leave room for sanitation. You either got used to the taste of iron and mildew or you didn't eat. Every peasant was one bad bowl away from enlightenment or dysentery, and still they showed up, cooked, ate, lived, occasionally. So next time you stress about that one unwashed spoon in the dishwasher, take a breath. You're not squatting by a fire scrubbing blood off a shared ladle with a handful of straw and goat spit. You're not blowing dust off your soup because the only lid you had was hope. You're not scraping stew from the inside of a bowl that once doubled as a wash basin and an emergency toilet. In the medieval kitchen, filth wasn't failure. It was background noise, a baseline hum of grime, the silent seasoning that made every bite a test of faith endurance and immune systems forged in literal dirt. Feasts in the medieval world were not what you're picturing. You're probably imagining long banquet tables, glowing candlelight, dignified nobles, daintily slicing roast swan, while a lute plays gently in the background. Cute. In reality, medieval feasts were chaotic, greasy, loud, and smelled like a wrestling match between a pig and a pile of garlic. If you walked away full and without a stab wound, you were one of the lucky ones. If your clothes weren't ruined by gravy or someone else's vomit, even better. A feast didn't mean a well-balanced, thoughtfully prepared multi-course meal. It meant all the food came out at once, piled onto platters, and everyone lunged like they'd just survived a siege. Which many of them had. Plates were optional, napkins were a hallucination, elbows were weapons, and the servers frightened. Always frightened. They knew what was coming. Food was torn apart with hands. Roasted birds were split in mid-air like medieval party tricks. Meat juices dripped down sleeves. Bread was used as a napkin, a plate a sponge, and sometimes a projectile. People shouted across tables, reached over each other, and occasionally climbed onto benches for a better angle at the mutton. There was no concept of waiting your turn. There were no turns, just survival. If you were rich, you sat closer to the front of the hall and got the good stuff, roast boar, spiced pies, honey glazed, whatever. If you were poor or lower ranked, you got the scraps, literally. Platters were passed down the table like ancient meat-covered conveyor belts. By the time they reached you, they'd been picked over, sneezed on, and occasionally licked. Bon appétit. The menu often included strange things: hedgehog stew, blackbird pie, cow tongue, whale blubber if you were really unlucky. The presentation was dramatic, entire animals stuffed inside each other. Pastries shaped like castles, jellied fish moulded into terrifying blobs. Flavour wasn't the goal, spectacle was. If it looked ridiculous and you could chew it without weeping, it made the cut. There were no forks, just knives' fingers and the occasional two-pronged utensil that looked more like a torture device than cutlery. Knives were personal, you brought your own, or borrowed someone else's and hoped they weren't drunk. Eating was not an elegant affair. You saw everything, heard everything, smelled everything, from burps to slurps to someone across the table sucking marrow out of a bone like it owed them money. And the grease. Oh, the grease. It coated everything. Your hands, your face, your clothes, your future. Meat wasn't trimmed. It was hacked. Fat dripped everywhere. Chickens were stuffed with pork, which was stuffed with onions, which was stuffed with raisins for some reason nobody remembered. Gravy was poured from jugs with no spouts, just hope. The floor was slick. So were your shoes and your morals. Feasts were loud, like violently loud. Musicians played, people shouted, dogs barked under tables hoping for dropped scraps. Sometimes they got full meals, sometimes they got stepped on. Everyone pretended not to notice. Jesters did backflips. Poets recited ballads. Someone juggled something flaming. And in the middle of all that, you tried to eat a pigeon leg with dignity. You failed. Sanitation not invited. Bones were tossed on the floor, so were oyster shells, bread crusts, and anything considered too chewy. Trenchers, those edible plates made of stale bread, were left to soak in gravy, and then thrown out, given to the poor or saved for later. No one washed dishes. The idea was laughable. Why wash a bowl when you could throw it at a minstrel who sang too loud? And yes, people got drunk. Very drunk. Wine flowed like water, mostly because actual water would kill you faster. Beer was safer, mead was stronger. Ale was everywhere. People mixed drinks, passed mugs, sloshed goblets. Toasts were shouted every 5 minutes. You didn't clink glasses. You smashed them against the table and screamed to victory, even if the only victory was not choking on a goose bone. Fights broke out, of course they did. Someone stepped on someone's pie. Someone else got the last slice of venison. Words were exchanged, knives were drawn, chairs were used as shields. It wasn't a real feast unless someone bled. The hosts pretended to be shocked. The guests pretended to care. And then everyone kept eating. Sometimes feasts lasted days. Food was reheated over and over until it resembled edible tar. Leftovers were mixed into new dishes. Wine was watered down until it tasted like foot. And the hall smelled like a barnyard that had lost a bet. By the third day, nobody remembered what they were celebrating. But the stew was still hot, and that was enough. Music never stopped. Dancers stumbled through reels. Singers croaked love songs while belching. Lutes twanged, drums thudded, and someone always had a tambourine they couldn't quite play. There were games. Guess the animal. Drink without using hands. Balance a pie on your head. Winners got more food. Losers also got food. Everyone won, and regretted it later. Even the nobles got messy. Their clothes were finer, sure. But by the end of the night, their sleeves were in their soup, and their shoes were soaked in gravy. They wiped their mouths on velvet, burped into gold goblets, slouched on pillows and laughed like maniacs while servants scrambled to keep the meat coming. It was indulgence on steroids, a performance of wealth so greasy it could fuel an empire. Servants suffered most. They carried food through crowds of drunk, aggressive diners, dodged flailing limbs, cleaned spills with rags that just spread the mess around. If a platter fell, their fault. If a guest puked, also their fault. If someone died from bad oysters, guess who got blamed? And then guess who had to carry the body out without interrupting the dancing? And the smells. Oh, the smells. A blend of meat, sweat, candle wax, wine dirt, and fear. You didn't breathe. You endured. By the time you stumbled outside into the cold, it felt like rebirth. Your ears rang. Your mouth was dry. Your tunic was ruined. But you had eaten, and somehow you were already craving more. So next time you complain that your dinner party is a little hectic, just remember, At least your guests aren't drunk nobles throwing turkey legs at each other across a floor slick with animal fat. At least you have forks, plates, soap, a ceiling not dripping with condensed pig steam. In the Middle Ages, a feast wasn't about elegance. It was about excess, noise, grease, chaos. Flavour came last, hunger came first. And you didn't sit at that table to eat, you sat at that table to survive. Let's talk dairy, because nothing says culinary thrill ride like warm milk in an era without refrigeration, sanitation, or a basic understanding of bacterial warfare. In medieval times, dairy was a gamble wrapped in a wooden bucket. Milk didn't last more than a few hours without turning into a yogurt impersonator, and even that was considered success. If you could sip milk without gagging or hallucinating, you were living the high life or had already lost your sense of smell. Butter, cheese and mould weren't just related. They were basically roommates who never cleaned. You didn't choose to make cheese back then. You made cheese because your milk went sour, and you refused to admit defeat. Cheese was survival. Butter was stubborn optimism churned until your arms gave out. And mould was the surprise guest who showed up uninvited and then refused to leave your pantry for 7 generations. Let's start with butter. You made it by shaking, churning, or violently rocking milk until it surrendered. This could take hours, days if the cow was having a spiritual crisis. Peasants didn't have fancy churns, they had buckets, wooden paddles, and endurance born from desperation. Sometimes they used children. Not because it was efficient, but because medieval childhood was 90% unpaid labour and 10% dodging rats. Once the butter came out, it was pressed into moulds or just slapped onto leaves and hoped for the best. No refrigeration meant butter went rancid fast. In summer, it melted into goo. In winter, it froze into yellow stone. Either way, it was scraped onto bread vegetables or your face if you were lucky enough to believe it healed skin conditions. Spoiler, it didn't. Butter could also be clarified, which was a fancy word for heating it until all the bits that made you sick floated away. But this was rare. Most people used it as is soft sour and covered in the fingerprints of everyone in the village. You didn't butter toast. You smeared it onto crust so hard they cried. And if the butter smelled off, you added herbs. Problem solved. Now cheese. Cheese was everything. It stored longer than milk, travelled better than meat, and provided just enough protein to keep peasants dreaming of better days. But making it wasn't romantic. You curdled the milk using whatever acid you had vinegar old wine stomach lining from a baby animal, yes, really, and then pressed the curds into shapes. Sometimes round, sometimes square, sometimes I dropped it, and now it's a triangle. The remaining liquid whey was fed to pigs or drunk straight if you hated yourself. The curds were aged in caves, barns, or under beds. Some cheeses were hard as rocks. Others were soft, creamy, and smelled like they'd fought in a war. And here's the secret: nobody knew what they were going to get. You made cheese and hoped. Sometimes it was edible, sometimes it stared back. Mould was a constant companion. Not the stylish blue vein type you'd find on a cheese board today, but the kind that made you pause mid-bite and ask yourself how much you valued your life. Cheeses grew their own ecosystems. Some developed rinds, some developed feelings. If the mould was fuzzy, green and moving, you scraped it off, or didn't, depending on how hungry you were and how bad the weather was. Even the rich weren't immune. Their cheeses were refined versions of the same gamble, more herbs, fancier storage, occasionally blessed by a priest. But guess what? Still mouldy. Still unpredictable. The only difference was someone wrote a poem about it afterward and called it a delicacy. If your cheese made you cry, it was either a masterpiece or food poisoning. Storage hilarious. Cheeses were hung in cloth buried in straw or left on shelves that mice treated like cheese Disneyland. Butter was hidden in wells wrapped in leaves or buried underground. Cool, dark places were precious. So were cellars. If you didn't have one, you had the corner near the dead goat. which, let's be honest, was more humid than helpful. Milk was rarely drunk straight. It was risky. Fast to spoil, full of floaty bits and occasionally crawling with surprises. Most people only drank it fresh from the cow. And by fresh I mean still warm. You got it, you drank it, you moved on. Or you didn't, and then your intestines held a town hall meeting you didn't survive. Cream rose to the top and was skimmed off for the rich, skimmed again for the richer. By the time the peasant got it, it was closer to sadness than dairy. But they used it anyway. Mixed with honey, it became a dessert. Mixed with stale bread, it became breakfast. Mixed with hope, it became disappointment. And all of it, milk, butter, cheese, was seasonal. Cows didn't produce endlessly. In winter, dairy dried up. You rationed, you hoarded. You wept while chewing on a rind so old it had its own birthday. Spring was salvation, new calves, new milk, new chances to ruin everything again with mould and a bit too much sun. Let's not forget goat milk. Goats were popular. Easier to feed, more aggressive and less likely to die of drama. Goat cheese was tangier, harder and more likely to be hurled across the room in frustration. People pretended to like it, but everyone knew cow was king. Goat was plan B. Sheep somewhere in between, like the awkward middle child of the dairy dynasty. Spoiled dairy had many fates. Some became new recipes, others became medicine. A few became horror stories whispered at night. Don't eat the blue curd, they'd say. That's how old man Geller lost his teeth. And yet, someone always did. And someone always regretted it. And the cycle continued. Despite all this, dairy was treasured. It sustained people. It filled stomachs. It clogged arteries. But mostly it gave hope, fat-laced, bacteria-riddled hope. You could survive a winter on cheese and dried bread. You could barter butter for meat. You could sit by a fire nibbling something vaguely creamy and pretend for one glorious moment that everything wasn't awful. So the next time you wince at a block of supermarket cheddar with a Best Buy date 6 weeks away, remember medieval people ate cheese that fought back. They churned butter in barrels full of flies. They drank milk that mooed from the bowl, and they smiled through it, mouldy teeth and all. Because in a world of famine, disease and dung fires, a good hunk of cheese mould and all was as close to joy as it got. Let's get one thing straight: in medieval times, drinking water wasn't brave, it was reckless. Crystal clear streams were poetic in songs, but in real life they were basically pipelines for dysentery. If it flowed, it was infected. If it stood still, it was worse. And if it smelled clean, that meant the parasites had finally outnumbered the bacteria and organised themselves into polite silence. Water sources were communal. That means your drinking spot was also the neighbourhood laundry station, fish skinning zone, sheep washing tub, and toddler bathing hole. Oh, and the place where people dumped the contents of their chamber pots, sometimes uphill, sometimes downstream, always directly into your future stomachache. So know when someone offered you a sip of fresh water, the correct response wasn't thank you, it was, are you trying to kill me? But people had to drink something. Enter alcohol, beer, ale, wine, mead, anything fermented and vaguely sterile. Not because medieval folks wanted to party every day, though. To be fair, they didn't mind. They drank booze because it was safer than hydration. That's not alcoholism. That's survival. Even children drank beer. Not the 12% ABV, let's ruin a wedding kind, but low-alcohol small beer brewed to be just strong enough to kill germs and weak enough to avoid knocking over toddlers. In some households, toddlers learn to walk and then immediately learn to carry a mug of beer. Priorities. Water was a last resort, like licking a frog during a drought and hoping for the best. Monasteries brewed the cleanest stuff. Monks, for all their chanting and self-denial, knew how to handle a fermentation vat. Their beer wasn't just delicious, it was disease insurance. Nobles imported wine, peasants brewed their own ale, and everyone, regardless of class, quietly agreed drinking water was an amateur move. Let's talk about wells. These were better slightly. Dug deep into the ground, often lined with stone. But guess what? Wells were also where people dropped garbage. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. Bodies fell in, rats drowned in them, buckets snapped and dragged half a lunch into the depths, and still the water was fetched, poured into jugs and politely referred to as cleanish. And then there were springs, nature's bottled water, right sure, unless someone upstream had just bled a pig into the runoff, or washed their leprosy cloth. Springs weren't monitored. There was no park ranger with a clipboard saying, "Actually, this isn't potable." There was just you, your thirst, and your ability to ignore the tadpole floating next to your cup. Boiling water was a thing, but not a common thing. Firewood was precious. People saved heat for cooking, not for making water less deadly. You only boiled drinking water if someone had just died from it, and you were trying to impress God with your sudden awareness. Otherwise you took a deep breath, held your nose, and drank whatever came out of the nearest bucket. Rainwater was collected in barrels. This was considered fresh. Unless it sat too long, grew a layer of moss and developed an ecosystem. Still better than the stream, though. You could ladle it out, strain it through a cloth which probably hadn't been washed since the plague, and drink it with only minor hallucinations. Sometimes people added herbs to water to purify it. Mint rosemary vinegar, thing that masked the taste of filth, and gave the illusion of cleanliness. Did it work? Not really, but it made people feel like they were doing something. Like brushing your teeth with honey and hoping for the best. A placebo with consequences. In cities, the water situation was even worse. Rivers doubled as sewers. Public fountains were crowded, contaminated, and frequently blessed by dogs. Some cities had aqueducts, ingenious feats of Roman engineering now clogged with gunk rats, and the occasional tax collector. So even the fancy townsfolk weren't immune to the occasional explosive diarrhea surprise party. When travellers arrived in new places, they brought their own booze, not to celebrate, to survive. Locals might drink the water because their bodies had adjusted to the local strain of microbes. Outsiders, dead in 3 days. Don't drink the water wasn't just travel advice, it was prophecy. Even bathing was risky. You might accidentally swallow some, or inhale it, or soak in a tub full of someone else's regrets, and walk away with a new rash, a new parasite, or a baby. Water wasn't just dangerous to drink, it was dangerous to exist near. Let's not forget cooking. Water was boiled for soup, but that didn't mean it was safe. It just meant it was less lethal. And often the water used in broth was whatever was left from laundry hand washing or washing vegetables, which, to be clear, was just swishing them around until the visible dirt looked less judgmental. So how did people survive? They built up immunity, slowly, painfully. Or they didn't survive and history moved on without them. Children died young. Adults had constant stomach issues. Diarrhea was not a joke. It was a fact of life. If you had a strong gut, you were blessed. If not, well, they probably named a soup after you and pretended it was an honour. And yet, in the middle of all this bacterial roulette, people still romanticised water. It was used in ritual ceremonies and poetic songs. They wrote odes to crystal brooks while vomiting into the bushes from a questionable cup of stream water. Hope springs eternal, even when hope comes with worms. So next time you fill your glass from the tap, look at that clean, colourless miracle and whisper a thank you. Because no one upstream is washing a goat in it. No one downstream is defecating in it. No one has drowned in that well recently. Probably. And you don't have to choose between thirst and death every time your lips touch a cup. In medieval times, wine was salvation, beer was sanity, and water was a dare. Medieval fast food existed, but not the kind that hands you a bag through a window and smiles. No, this was the kind that handed you something warm, wet, and questionably shaped, served from a cart parked next to a sewage ditch. It was hot. It was edible by a loose definition. And it was fast, mostly because if you stopped to think about it, you'd drop it and run. Convenience trumped clarity. Hunger drowned out hesitation. Street vendors were the lifeblood of a medieval urban survival. For the poor, cooking at home meant gathering wood, begging for flour, or burning dung into your soup. Buying food on the street was sometimes cheaper, always easier. and came with the thrill of possibly eating something illegal, exotic, or recently dead. Street pies, skewers, roasted organs, stews in wooden cups. It was medieval tapas with a dash of tetanus. The most popular item, meat pies. Glorious steaming pockets of mystery. The crust was thick and sometimes edible. Sometimes it was just a container like a ceramic bowl made of flour and prayer. Inside could be pork, could be fish, could be pigeon, could be a rat. No one asked. That was the deal. If it tasted good and didn't bite back, you finished it and moved on. Rat meat wasn't advertised, but it happened. Rats were everywhere. In walls, on carts, under cloaks in the pies. Vendors didn't always kill the rats intentionally. Sometimes they just used what was nearby warm and already half-cooked by sun exposure. If you bit into something stringy, crunchy and slightly squeaky, you either kept chewing or made peace with your god right then and there. Hair was part of the experience. Animal hair, sure, but also human hair, rat hair, mystery hair. Vendors didn't wear gloves, or hats, or shoes half the time. The food was handled with the same hands that just wiped sweat, shooed flies, and probably scratched something that shouldn't be scratched in public. But that didn't stop the line from forming. Skewers were another favourite. Meat chunks, supposedly. Charred on the outside, pink on the inside, occasionally still twitching. They came from grills balanced on bricks over open flames fueled by wood scraps or dung. You ate them fast before the flies laid claim. Sometimes you found a bone, sometimes you found a tooth, never yours, hopefully. Then there were portable soups. Vendors carried barrels of boiling broth, ladled it into cups and dropped in whatever chunks they had. Vegetables maybe, bread maybe, hoof. Often. One stew could be beef 1 minute and turnip the next. Nobody questioned the consistency. Because the only consistent thing was the price and the danger. Breakfasts were often hot cakes, oat patties, or fried dough. These were made from leftover grains, mashed beans or flour that may or may not have included sawdust. They were fried in fat that had been used all week. Sometimes animal fat, sometimes reused candle wax. The smoke curled up in grey wisps that smell like meat and despair. Still better than starting your day hungry. Food safety inspections didn't exist. The closest thing was public shaming. If someone died after eating at a stall, people might avoid it for a day. If too many people got sick, a city official might issue a fine. Maybe. But more likely the vendor just moved 6 streets down and kept selling the same sausage with a new name. Street justice was literal. If your pie betrayed you, your only recourse was yelling. And then there were fish stalls. Nothing says brave like ordering fish on a summer afternoon in a medieval city. The smell slapped you before you even saw the cart. Fish were displayed on wooden planks, half flies, half sun-dried. You could buy one whole or chopped or mashed into a paste and slathered on bread like a crime against humanity. The brave got cod, the unlucky got eel, the foolish got river fish, whatever floated in that day. Street cheese was also common. Soft, pungent, wrapped in cloth that might have been clean once in a distant century. Vendors handed it to you like treasure. You took it like a dare. The taste tangy, the texture ambiguous, the aftertaste eternal. Desserts existed if you had the coin and the courage. Honeycakes, fried fruit, sugar-dusted nuts, all carried by hands as sticky as the sweets themselves. Children begged for them. Adults bought them for energy. Everyone got cavities. Medieval dentistry was not forgiving. One caramelized date too many and you were toothless before 30. And the smells. Oh, the smells. A street full of food carts was a perfume of meat, grease, sour ale, garlic, open sewage, burning fat and unwashed humanity. Dogs lingered. Rats watched like judges. Birds tried to snatch food mid-air. Vendors yelled over each other. Fresh pigeon pie, hot gut soup, boiled eggs, maybe duck, and people came running. For the poor, street food wasn't a choice, it was survival. You ate what you could afford, what you could chew, what didn't bite back. Some stalls had regulars. Old Maud's boiled tongue was beloved in some quarters. Arlo's mystery pudding had a reputation for being both satisfying and oddly crunchy. Reputation was everything, but so was hunger. Eating in the street was a social event. People squatted by barrels, sat on crates, stood in clusters. They gossiped, laughed, occasionally fought over the last pie. No one asked for utensils. No one asked where the meat came from. You ate. You lived. You hoped. And if something didn't sit right, you didn't complain. You ran to a ditch and re-evaluated your choices, or blamed the weather, or the devil, or the moon. Because surely no one would put bad meat in a pie. That would be immoral, and in a world full of rot that was the biggest joke of all. So next time you complain that your fast food fries are too cold, or your burger bun is slightly stale, remember somewhere in 1382, a man bit into a meat pie, pulled out something with a tail and kept chewing, because he was hungry, and because hope, like everything else back then, came with fur. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just a matter of survival, it was also a matter of salvation. The church had rules, lots of them, especially when it came to eating. When to eat, what to eat, and most importantly, what not to eat. Your stomach didn't run your meal schedule, God did. And he wasn't in a hurry. Fasting wasn't just for Lent. It was a lifestyle. Nearly half the calendar was marked by food restrictions. That meant no meat, no eggs, no dairy, no fun. Fridays were especially sacred because nothing honours the crucifixion of Christ like a dinner of cold turnips and fish that smells like it's halfway through its own resurrection. But here's where it gets hilarious. People found loopholes. Brilliant, absurd, utterly medieval loopholes. The church said, no meat fine, eat beaver. Why? Because someone convinced a bishop that since beaver spent most of their time in water and had a tail like a fish, they technically were fish. Theology by tail shape. Approved and sanctified. God bless taxonomy. Otters got the same treatment. So did puffins. Yes, puffins. Apparently they looked like fish if you squinted during Mass and ignored the wings. Monasteries on remote islands roasted puffins with all the righteous guilt of a man following the letter, not the spirit of the law. Fish Fridays became feathered affairs. Morality served on a bed of irony. There was even a debate about barnacle geese. These strange birds migrated from unknown lands and were never seen nesting. The theory they grew from driftwood or hatched underwater, therefore clearly fish. Entire religious texts debated this. Philosophers weighed in. Paintings were made. And while scholars argued about divine poultry taxonomy, peasants just wanted to know if it tasted better than salted eel. Fasting days weren't limited to Lent or Fridays. Advent had them. Ember days, rogation days, random bishop birthdays. In total, you might be fasting for more than half the year. That's not a diet, that's theological food jail. People weren't thin because of willpower. They were thin because piety had a calorie cap. Monks followed strict food rules. In theory. In practice, monastic loopholes. No eating after sunset meant dinner moved up, or counted as a collation, a small snack that mysteriously included cheesebread soup, and sometimes an entire second dinner if nobody was watching. Gluttony was a sin. But so was starving your brothers. Balance blessed be. For the truly devout fasting was punishment with purpose. They believed denying the body purified the soul. Some saints survived on nothing but herbs and water for months. Others lived on communion wafers and sheer determination. But most people were just trying not to die of scurvy while pretending turnips counted as spiritual enlightenment. The poor ironically fasted by default. Not out of virtue, but because meat was expensive and eggs were seasonal and cheese had mouldy moods. So when the church said no meat, peasants shrugged. Great, they thought. So, Tuesday. The rich meanwhile had to pretend to struggle. They hired cooks to create fake meat dishes. Mock goose. Almond milk cheeses, fish moulded to look like ham, penance with flair. Feasting was allowed after fasting, but not always. The church liked control. You couldn't just decide to throw a feast. It had to be approved. aligned with a saint's day, accompanied by prayers, and probably paid for with an indulgence or two. Food and forgiveness were closely linked, sometimes disturbingly so. Breaking fast rules could lead to punishment, public shaming, extra prayers, even excommunication. Though honestly, excommunication didn't always mean much unless you were rich. Poor folks just avoided the priest for a few days and hoped heaven had better policies. Let's not forget the dietary advice of the church: eat modestly. Avoid gluttony. Don't overindulge, unless it's at a bishop's banquet. Then go wild. Because what's a little hypocrisy between friends, especially when there's roasted swan and pomegranate sauce involved? Even fish days got complicated. Shellfish were allowed, frogs were debated, eels became the go-to solution, long, slippery, and just fishy enough to count. Entire monasteries raised eels in ponds. Nobles had eel chefs. Recipes were invented. The Lord saith, "Thou shalt eat slime serpents with mustard, no shame." The rules weren't just about meat. Fasting often meant one meal a day, sometimes two if one was collation. People got creative. A small snack could include half a loaf of bread, soup, pickled vegetables, and an eel pretending to be a carrot. Monks measured portions. Peasants measured distance from judgment. And during Lent was the Olympics of food restriction. 40 days of no meat, no dairy, no eggs. Almond milk was churned into everything. Fish was everywhere. Grumbling was universal. But Easter hit like a medieval food rave. Roasts, cheese, honey, wine. Everyone emerged from their pious caves like starved wolves wearing church clothes. Even children were taught to fast. Not for health, but for discipline. Teach the stomach to obey and the soul follows. That was the idea. In practice, it just made kids hangry, but nobody dared question divine logic, especially not on a Friday with cold pea soup. Still, for all the oddities and contradictions, fasting brought communities together. Shared hunger, shared rules, shared suffering. Even if someone was sneaking a salted sausage behind the hayloft, everyone else pretended not to notice. Because starving together, that's spiritual bonding. So next time you roll your eyes at Meatless Monday, remember your medieval ancestor went 6 weeks eating nothing but leeks, pickled trout and almond paste, moulded into the shape of a roast duck. And they did it because a monk with a scroll said so, while he was chewing fish pie and debating whether otters had souls. Let's start gently, because this part isn't. In the medieval kitchen, children were often involved in cooking. Not as chefs, but as living multi-tools. They gathered wood, fetched water, plucked chickens, stirred pots, ground grain, and occasionally became the potholders themselves. If a child had arms, they were strong enough to churn butter. If they had legs, they were fast enough to run to the well. Childhood wasn't about playing. It was about not dying while helping someone else avoid the same fate. Most kids knew how to light a fire by age 5. By 6, they were cleaning fish. By 7, they'd seen things that would make a modern adult consider therapy. They cut vegetables with knives larger than their own forearms stood too close to open flames, and burned themselves on pots filled with boiling sadness. No one blinked. That was just life. Crying didn't cook the stew faster. Training was brutal. There were no cookbooks, just older siblings screaming, "Not that herb," and the occasional slap with a wooden spoon. Measurement. You poured until someone yelled, "Enough." Seasoning, taste it, and hope. Mistakes were punished swiftly. Food wasted meant food lost, and that could mean hunger for the whole family. If the meat was overcooked, it was your fault. If the meat was undercooked, it was also your fault. If there was no meat, still your fault somehow. And when famine came, and it always came, children still cooked. They cooked bark, boiled nettles, roasted shoe leather. They crushed acorns into meal-mashed weeds into porridge, and tried to make soup out of bones that had already been boiled 3 times. They worked with what they had. What they didn't have was nourishment. Kids cooked while starving, stirred while shaking, cleaned pots they hadn't eaten from in days. Sometimes when the famine lasted long enough, people stopped cooking for children and started cooking instead of them. Yes, cannibalism happened. Not everywhere, not often. But when the grain stores were empty, the rivers frozen, and the pigs long gone, the unthinkable crept into kitchens. Chronicles tell of sieges where families boiled leather and ate rats until there were no more rats. And then came the rumours. Neighbours who went missing, screams muffled, bones found behind homes, cookpots never shared. In 1315, Europe was hit with one of the worst famines in recorded history. 3 years of cold rains, crop failure, and absolute desperation. People ate grass, dirt, pets. Then things got darker. Contemporary records mention it softly, cautiously flesh of man-meat of their own kind, child roasted and consumed. And the worst part, some entries note that children were sold during famine years not for labour but for meat. Wrap your head around that. Were all these stories true? Hard to say. Some were probably exaggerations, the medieval version of tabloid horror, but some weren't. Some were whispered by monks who had no reason to lie. Starvation rewrites morality, and when hunger eats your mind, it starts looking at everyone differently, including the smallest, weakest ones. Still, let's zoom out. These were not monsters. These were humans in hellish conditions. People don't roast their own unless something has utterly broken, and famine didn't break people, it shattered them, piece by piece. You don't wake up and say, today I'll eat a child. You wake up and realise there's nothing else, and then someone knocks, offers meat, and doesn't say where it came from. Back to the kitchens, kids also got cooked by accident. They fell into fires, tipped over cauldrons, tripped into baking pits. Cooking areas were open unguarded, full of flames and boiling liquids. One wrong move, and a toddler became stew ingredient by physics, not design. These accidents weren't rare. And since death was already a daily guest, sometimes people didn't even flinch. Even funeral customs turned grim during famines. Bodies couldn't always be buried. They were too numerous. The ground was frozen, graves were shallow, and the temptation to repurpose what nature returned was real. There's a Latin chronicle that tells of a man who watched his neighbour dig up a corpse, slice off meat, and cook it over an open flame. He didn't report him, he joined him. Children, when not being tragically eaten, were still part of the famine economy. They were abandoned, given away, sent to monasteries not for piety but for soup. Some were bartered, my son, for your grain. Others were sent out into the woods with baskets and hope and never came back. The forest took many, starvation took more. There's even a record from Russia during the time of troubles, a little later, yes, but same vibe where two parents were caught keeping their children during the famine, not to protect them, but to trade with neighbours, rotating, whose child would be eaten first, so no one lost them all at once. A horrifying version of taking turns, civilization at its most skeletal. And yet life went on. Somehow. Kids who survived learned to steal food, lie better hide meat, and make nettle stew that wouldn't kill you. They grew up into the adults who passed down survival recipes that didn't make sense until the next famine arrived. Recipes like rat stuffed with leeks, boiled belt soup, acorn bread version 3. The emotional toll never spoken. Medieval society didn't have trauma counsellors. You wept in silence. Or you didn't. You buried the memory under a mountain of barley gruel and kept chewing. If a child asked what happened to my brother, you told them he went to live with monks, or to heaven, or that he was called by the angels. Because no one wants to say we cooked him, because we had to. So next time you hear a story about how medieval people were simpler, more faithful, more moral, remember this part. The part where hunger turned them into ghosts of themselves. Where the pot kept bubbling even when the fields were empty, where children didn't just help cook, but sometimes unthinkably tragically became the meal. That's not a punchline, that's a scar. A scar written in the margins of monastic journals, whispered through the generations and passed down as warnings. Because when you're starving, your body begs, and history listens. Let's bust a myth. The upper class in the Middle Ages didn't dine like modern royalty, they dined like wealthy animals wearing silk. Sure, the setting looked impressive. Polished silver, velvet tablecloths, crystal goblets filled with wine too sweet to swallow without flinching. But scratch beneath the surface and what you got was the same grime, the same germs, and the same deeply unsettling smell of old meat, just with better candlelight and worse manners. Noble feasts were meant to display power. That was the entire point. You weren't feeding guests, you were intimidating them. The more food on the table, the more animals roasted whole, the more pies stuffed with other pies, stuffed with birds, stuffed with spices from the east, the more your guest was supposed to mutter, "Wow," between gulps of overly salted venison. It wasn't about nourishment. It was performance, culinary theatre, with occasional diarrhea. Yes, the cutlery was fancier if you had it. Forks were still suspicious, seen by some nobles as effeminate or devilish. So most people just used knives and hands like peasants, except their knives had jewels on the hilt, and their hands were covered in rings so big they could double as clubs. Bread served as a plate and fingers served as spoons. Elbows were on the table and so were dogs. Did we mention the dogs nobles loved having dogs under the table? Not outside, under. To catch dropped bones, lick greasy boots, and occasionally bite a guest who looked too French. Cats wandered around too, especially near the kitchens where they served the dual function of pest control and accidental stew ingredient. Animals were part of the experience, like ambiance or mood lighting. The food itself, impressive in volume, questionable in taste. Rich folks had access to spices, imported sugar, saffron, and every kind of meat you can imagine, and several you probably shouldn't. But seasoning was about showing off, not balance. Sweet meat. Meat soaked in rose water. Fish dyed bright blue for no reason. You didn't ask, is it good? You asked, did it sparkle? And because there was no refrigeration even for the elite, everything was either heavily salted, aggressively spiced, or just slightly rotten and politely ignored. Meat might be aged in the hallway. Poultry might be prepared hours in advance, left in a warm kitchen, with curious servants and even more curious flies. If the cook added enough cinnamon, you barely noticed. Barely. Food was carved at the table live in front of everyone. Not by guests, of course. That job went to the carver, a professional trained to slice peacock boar and stuffed swan with flair, and no accidents usually. Carvers had their own knives, their own rituals, and sometimes their own prayers. Because when you're hacking into a goose covered in gold leaf and fireworks, you need divine help. And while the guests sat at the Lord's high table, lower-ranked nobles, knights, clerics, and opportunistic poets packed the benches below, scraping gravy from trenchers and trying not to choke on bones. The further you sat from the Lord, the colder your food, and the more likely it was that your cup had already been used by someone with a loose relationship to dental hygiene. Speaking of which, dental hygiene. Nobles brushed their teeth with cloth-chewed herbs and sometimes rinsed with wine. Their smiles looked better than peasants' sure. But that was a low bar. Most noble mouths were a battlefield of blackened molars and infected gums, just better hidden behind lace and titles. Hands that touched your food, not washed. Maybe rinsed in a shared bowl once in a while, but mostly rubbed on napkins made of cloth that hadn't seen soap in weeks. Or on the tablecloth, or the dog. Gloves were decorative. Cleanliness was relative, and the smell of grease clung to fingers long after the meal and the memory had passed. Let's talk about leftovers. Because yes, nobles had them. They didn't eat everything. Sometimes because they couldn't. Sometimes because the food was inedible. Sometimes because it moved when they poked it. Leftovers were scraped into buckets and given to servants, poor folk, or thrown out the window into the courtyard where they'd become part of the grand compost pile that also doubled as a moat. And yes, servants ate those leftovers, sometimes gratefully, sometimes cautiously. Because while the duck confit might be tasty, it also might have been sitting on a pewter plate for 4 hours next to a sweaty lord who mistook it for an ashtray. Still better than boiling nettles. Noble kitchens were huge, hot and chaotic, Fires roared all day. Pots the size of bathtubs simmered constantly. Kitchen boys ran barefoot through grease-balancing platters. Cooks screamed. Dogs barked. Meat hung from the ceiling. Fish flopped in basins. And at the end of it all, 90% of the work went into 10% of the food because the other 90% was there purely to look extravagant before being discarded. Did nobles eat more? Definitely. Did they eat better? Not necessarily. They had more variety, yes, but also more access to dangerous indulgences, spoiled shellfish, undercooked poultry, poisonous mushrooms, misidentified by some illiterate forager who swore it was definitely fine last time. Rich people died from eating badly just as fast as the poor. They just died in fancier robes. And of course, no feast was complete without vomiting. Rich folks ate a lot. Then they purged, sometimes in private, sometimes not. Vomitoriums, contrary to popular myth, weren't actual rooms in medieval castles, but the practice of controlled puking was real. Some nobles carried special spoons to tickle their throats after the fourth course, because nothing says elegance like forced regurgitation between dancing swans and poetry. Entertainment continued through the meal. Jesters juggled eels. Minstrels sang about saints and sausages. Dancers whirled past steaming trays of stew. And in one legendary case, a nobleman's birthday cake was served by a trained bear, who had a minor tantrum and took out half the dessert table. That was considered a highlight. Religion played a role too. Meals opened with prayers, ended with blessings, and during Lent, nobles followed church rules creatively. No meat, eat whale. No cheese, call it almond paste. No gluttony. Define gluttony with your own private monk and a side of trout baked in cream. At the end of the feast, nobles wiped their fingers on linen burped and waddled off to complain about gout. Servants cleaned up the mess, rats celebrated, and everyone agreed it was a fine evening even if the duck tasted suspicious and the custard moved on its own. So next time someone tells you the nobility lived clean and ate well, remind them that the silver spoon was polished, yes, but it was still dipping into the same chaos. Their tables weren't cleaner, just shinier, just louder, just cloaked in lace and arrogance, and occasionally flammable. Let's be clear. There was no stove in the way you're imagining it. No knobs, no dials, no oven mitts embroidered with wine puns. What they had was an open flame in a confined space surrounded by wood-straw angry animals, barefoot children, and a cook on the brink of a mental breakdown. It wasn't just a heat source, it was a death trap with a side of soup. The typical medieval kitchen looked like a blacksmith's nightmare. Flames licked up from giant hearths. Smoke coiled under the thatch roof like it had nowhere better to be. Soot coated every surface like a second skin. Cooks navigated slick stone floors, dodging bubbling cauldrons and airborne grease, while holding trays the size of small doors. If you didn't slip, trip, or catch fire, it was considered a good day. Fire management was a full-time job. Want to bake bread? You needed a very specific temperature, which meant shoveling coals, watching the flames, checking the oven, by literally sticking your hand in and hoping the resulting third-degree burn would tell you something useful. There were no thermometers. You judged heat by pain guesswork and how loudly the lard hissed when it hit the pan. You think your modern kitchen gets hot? Try standing in a room with 3 roaring hearths, 0 ventilation and enough steam to blind a goat. The air was heavy with the scent of meat, mildew and sweat. Not the fun summer BBQ kind of meat. More like mystery meat that had been aged for a week under a butcher's armpit. And the mildew wasn't decoration. It grew freely on every damp corner that hadn't been touched since the last plague. And let's not forget the oven. Medieval ovens were stone-lined, flame-fueled death boxes. You built a fire inside the dome, waited for it to heat the stone, then swept out the ash by hand, and tossed in your food while praying it wouldn't catch fire or die of uneven baking. Half the loaf might come out raw, the other half blacker than a widow's veil. The smell toasted hope and soot. Most kitchens were tucked far from the main house, not out of design, but fear. Fire was the number one enemy of medieval architecture, and kitchens were walking arson threats. One poorly aimed spark and poof, there goes your manor. That's why noble kitchens were often in separate buildings. Peasant homes. Well, too bad. Your fire pit was right next to your straw bed and that suspicious pile of dry laundry. Cooks didn't work alone. They had assistants known as scullions, who were essentially human shields against boiling water, angry geese, and cuts from knives so dull they required sheer rage to slice anything. Scullions stirred, chopped-hauled buckets, and occasionally passed out from heat exhaustion. They were the unsung heroes, the ones who made it possible for rich folks to eat peacocks stuffed with smaller birds without ever smelling a coal. Every day was a performance. Timing was everything. Dishes were expected hot even if the kitchen was 4 buildings away and uphill both directions. Food travelled on wooden trays through hallways filled with nobles' pets and random monks arriving lukewarm and vaguely alive. If it was cold, guess who got whipped? Hint not the monk. And still, despite all the risk, all the sweat, all the burns, the medieval kitchen never stopped. There were no breaks, only meals, one after another. Feast could last hours. Bread had to be baked daily. Porridge had to bubble at dawn. Meat had to be stewed for hours or roasted until the skin could stop a crossbow bolt. It was war, with aprons. Hygiene. What hygiene? Raw meat shared, counters with cheese. Knives were rinsed in buckets darker than night. Hands were wiped on aprons already soaked in blood grease and yesterday's chicken panic. There were no gloves, no soap, and if you got a cut, you just hoped the garlic in the stew would act as an antibiotic. Spoiler, it didn't. The fire was moody. Too much wood and you burned everything. Too little and your lord's duck came out raw, setting off a chain reaction of noble tantrums, kitchen punishments, and possible execution if the king was watching. The fire was never your friend. It hissed, it smoked, it spat grease in your eyes, but you couldn't look away, because fire was the heart of the kitchen and the demon that powered it. Then there were the wild cards, rats that fell into soup, cats that leapt onto tables, bees that attacked sugar, drunken servants who dropped trays, dogs that licked the roast, and still the cook screamed, stirred salted, and prayed that the meat wouldn't explode mid-feast. Yes, meat sometimes exploded. Ask anyone who's roasted a stuffed pig without slitting the skin. It's a porky grenade. The kitchen was chaos incarnate. A medieval Gordon Ramsay hellscape minus the cameras and plus a 70% chance of plague. Cooks swore constantly. They fought over ladles. They threatened each other with turnips. And yet miraculously food was made. Somehow. Meals happened. Hunger faded. People lived to eat another day. Or died from it. Same difference. The next time your microwave beeps too loud or your delivery order's 10 minutes late, picture this. A barefoot teenager stirring blood pudding in a room so smoky it needs its own priest. A fire that just ate the chicken and half a curtain. A noble yelling about cold venison. A dog vomiting in the corner. And a cook who hasn't blinked in 12 hours. That was the stove. That was the standard. So no, you wouldn't last 10 minutes near that stove. You'd scream trip over a goose and crawl back to your modern fridge like a broken gladiator. You'd weep at the sight of a sink. You'd sob with joy at the push of a button. You'd kiss your smoke detector and hug your Instant Pot. Because compared to the medieval kitchen, anything is luxury. And the cook. She's still in there, stirring, swearing, sweating, a saint of survival. So next time you dine in candlelight and call it rustic, remember, there's nothing romantic about cooking with soot in your lungs and the fear of being boiled alive in a communal accident. Medieval stoves didn't care about aesthetics, they cared about smoke, and they always got what they wanted.